for covering so much of what I'm going to talk about today. So in a very great way, and just for being such a generous introducer. Hannah Arendt has this phrase, thinking without banisters, and it's often used metaphorically to mean that you have to think on your own. That is, you have to think without others behind you and think for yourself. But in a material sense, we all know that thinking does require banisters. It requires a lot of support, and I just want to start today by saying how grateful I am to the Radcliffe Institute for giving me all these banisters for this year to really think, to take a break from teaching, to try some stuff out. So I'll be eternally grateful. My project this year and what I'm looking at the Radcliffe Institute is legal naturalization. And what I'm interested in about naturalization is that it's the only way that a person who's not linked to a state by birth or descent can be granted citizenship within it. And at the outset, if it wasn't clear from Meredith's introduction, I should say I'm not a lawyer, so don't ask me for legal advice after this. And I'm not a historian. I'm a literary and critical theorist. And I say that because I'm not trying to exonerate myself from any relevance or relationship to truth, but because the way I approach naturalization and immigration in general is different from how a legal historian may choose to go about looking at it. As a critical theorist, I'm really drawn to the fictional and rhetorical forms of laws and rights. And I also look for the history of law beyond its expression in law itself, or positivistic law. So in the past, I've written about human rights quite a bit, and their basis in the abstract principle of humanity. And before humanity, it was the abstract principle of nature, human nature. For this new project, I'm looking more at naturalization and the sort of coincidence that it developed as a legal process at the same time that the novel was developing in England. So just as naturalization was becoming a matter of public debate in England, the novel as a new genre, long prose fiction, was becoming a new form of literature. And I think we can learn a lot about both law and literature from looking at these two things together. So today, my talk's going to be in 3 parts. I'm going to review the book that I co-authored on the right to have rights, which Meredith mentioned, because it's really this project and where it left me that inspired me to start digging into naturalization. So I'll just rehearse that a little bit more. Then I'm going to talk about the history of naturalization and my interest in it. And in the third part, which is in many ways still under a lot of active construction, I'm going to turn to the history of the novel as a way to sort of look at naturalization differently. Okay, so part 1. In January, I published with a legal historian, a political scientist, and an activist, a book called The Right to Have Rights. Here it is, it's quite green. You won't miss it. And the book offered a very, very intensely close reading of Hannah Arendt's phrase, the right to have rights. In fact, each author, we broke the phrase down into 4 parts, and each of us took a part. And I was responsible for writing about the first right in the phrase. And the phrase, the right to have rights, grows out of Arendt's experience as a stateless refugee. In 1933, she flees Nazi Germany for Paris. And 2 years later, she and other German Jews are effectively lose their citizenship in Germany. In France, she's interned as an enemy national in a camp, but she is able to luckily escape when the Germans occupy France. There's a bit of some confusion, and she gets out. And she makes an appeal while in the unoccupied part of France to some US diplomats. However, the US State Department at the time is actively discouraging giving visas to German Jews, or any refugees for that matter. But through a combination of luck and quick thinking, and a person in the US State Department who's prepared to defy the orders of his superiors, she is able to secure a Nansen passport, a French exit visa, a Spanish and Portuguese transit visa, and a US emergency visa. It's a lot of visas. In 1941, she's given asylum in the US, and in 1951, she's naturalized as a US citizen. In the same year as her naturalization, 1951, she publishes The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is her first English language book. And you may have heard it after the election in 2016. It became something of a mysterious bestseller where a lot of people were buying it, hoping for answers. In one of the book's central chapters, which is the chapter in which the right to have rights appears, she reflects on what her experience as a stateless refugee taught her about the ways in which individuals come to gain and lose rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaims that human rights have rights simply by the virtue of being human. But Arendt knew firsthand that in order to have rights, individuals must be more than simply human beings. They must, she insisted, be members of a political community. Only as a citizen of a nation state can a person enjoy legally protected rights to education, to work, to health care, to culture, and so on. And so Arendt declared that there must be something called the right to have rights before we can have any other kinds of rights. And here's how it appears. I'll just show you. This is probably the only text I'll have up here for you tonight, but it's really important, and we spent a lot of time on it in the book. I'll read it to you. We became aware of the existence of a right to have rights, and that means to live in a framework where one is judged according to actions and opinions, and a right to belong to some kind of organized community, only when there suddenly emerged millions of people who had lost and could not regain these rights because of the new global political situation. And in my work on the book, one of the things I do is I emphasize that this is a really strange right, and it's because of its temporality. It's a right that comes into existence. We become aware of it only when it's already disappeared. And I end up calling the right to have rights what I call post-right. It's a right that makes itself known only when the possibility of its arrival has already gone. And I'm still looking for a really great Latin term or something to describe this, some kind of rhetorical term. So if anybody has any ideas, I'd love to know. So it's less of a right that can be used or employed than a eulogy for a right that no longer exists. It's not something we can stage or argue for in Arendt's thinking. It's something that we discover as lost, and that's its tragedy. What Arendt wanted to show is that even when someone performs a right to have rights by showing up in public and making a demand for it, as we've all seen in the news in multiple places, there still needs to be a nation state to recognize it. I'll offer you a brief example that I talk about a little bit in the book. In 2014, residents of Detroit, Michigan filed a lawsuit against the city because it had shut off the running water of some residents who couldn't afford to pay their water bills. And the judge ruled against the residents, saying that, quote, water is a necessary ingredient to sustaining life, but there's no enforceable right to water. So in response, the residents called on the United Nations, and they wanted to claim that their right to water in Detroit was a human right. So Arendt, I think, would undoubtedly, had she been alive, by the way, the anniversary of her death is yesterday, I think she would have recognized the polemical value of this move. It's a shaming mechanism. But while the claim certainly garnered a lot of media publicity, it doesn't have the force to produce a right to water under US law. The appeal to human rights in this case merely reinforced the lack of enforceable right in the civic national context. The United Nations could make, quote, recommendations and, quote, do a fact-finding mission, but it couldn't validate the right of a claim to water. There's no guarantee that a performative claim to rights will be validated, especially if the community that a rights claimant seeks entrance into is the very community that's responsible for its loss of rights. And that's, of course, something that Arendt knew deeply from her experience as a subject of the Nuremberg laws, which made all Jews like herself alien nationals, of alien blood, sorry. After fleeing the detention center in France, Arendt doesn't go back to Germany to make a performative claim of her right to have rights. No, she escapes to America. The country of her birth, the community on which she might stake a claim of membership, was actively the country that didn't want her there. And so Arendt's point, and she goes on to make this point in a very detailed and lengthy way, is that there's no universal right to citizenship. There's only two loopholes that she identifies in her writing for a stateless refugee to gain citizenship, or at least the attention of the nation state. One is they can commit a crime. Getting yourself arrested, she said, is at least one way of getting acknowledged by the state. The other loophole is that a stateless person or a refugee can somehow become famous. And this is Mamadou Gassama. He was formerly an undocumented migrant in France, and this past summer, he was granted citizenship from the French government after he scaled a building to rescue a small child from falling. It is true, says Arendt, that the chances of the famous refugee are improved just as a dog with a name has a better chance to survive than a stray dog who is just a dog in general. So that's what I finished. And it left me in a pretty pessimistic place in my conclusion. I had to note that at the time of her writing, Arendt thought that America was the one hopeful place. And she said that America was always a place that welcomed its newcomers. But I think we have reason to be suspicious of her place of hope. And so it was at this moment that I decided that I wanted to look at naturalization and its history, because it seemed to offer something more concrete than abstract principles of human right. With naturalization, we can see how historically citizenship has been created for foreigners. And I actually got the idea, and I didn't quite know it at the time, from Arendt herself, who has this throwaway line in The Origins of Totalitarianism. She says that unlike their happier predecessors in the religious wars, the refugees after World War II could be welcomed nowhere and assimilated nowhere. So one of my first questions was, well, who are these happier refugees? And what was so different about immigration in the late 17th and 18th centuries? On what basis were all of these refugees received and integrated in a time before, quote unquote, human rights? So I began to explore. I spent some time at the archives at the Clark Library at UCLA and the glorious Huntington Library in Los Angeles. And I've done quite a bit of digging with the help of three incredible research assistants, Tamara, Jessica, and Jessica and Amanda. Thank you. They're not here tonight, but I really have appreciated, because it's been a lot of work, and we've been digging around in old, musty law books trying to figure out what this history might look like. And I'll tell you the story so far as I'm constructing it for myself. Prior to the Napoleonic period, nationality was decided by the feudal tradition of jus soli. Now, jus soli dates back to a medieval system in which a subject owes undying allegiance to the monarch under whom they're born. And this tradition, this feudal tradition, gets refined into English common law following this important legal case called Calvin's case, 1608. And in this case, the court had to decide whether a young Scottish child named Robert Kelvin, whether he had the right to inherit a family estate in London. That was the case. And the court did decide that Robert Kelvin did have the right to inherit the estate, because at the time of his birth, the English king's sovereignty had extended to Scotland. So Calvin's case made the all-important ruling that is detectable in American nationality law today, that a person's membership in a national community is determined by the place of their birth. And you might be interested to know that jus soli, or birthright citizenship as it's sometimes called, is still the dominant principle of citizenship in the United States and in Canada, though scarcely anywhere else in the world. Even England, who's responsible for the idea or tradition of jus soli, no longer retains it as a principle. But in addition to making this important ruling about birthright citizenship, Calvin's case also addressed how non-subjects, namely the Scots, could be made into subjects in law. And so that ruling really was interested in, okay, what do we do with the Scots? How do we make them English subjects? But over the course of the century, the 17th, but especially into the 18th century, that debate about naturalization would take on more people from different backgrounds and places. And the biggest one happened in 1685, when Louis XIV, he revokes the Edict of Nantes. And the Edict of Nantes, which had given tolerance to Catholics Protestants who were living in Catholic France. And so hundreds of thousands, it's an enormous scale, of Protestants had to flee France at the risk of being violently converted to Catholicism. They went all over the place. Many of them fled to the Netherlands, Switzerland, Wales, and an estimated 50,000 of what were known as the Huguenots came to England, and which is to this day one of the largest emigrations of a single ethnic community into England. So that's around 1685. And it's these refugees who Arendt refers to as happier. And in many ways, they were considered what we might today call model immigrants. They were highly skilled craftspeople, and they worked primarily as weavers. And they were Protestants, so the English quite liked them. And they decided that they were going to try and use naturalization to entice more of them to come over. And this is when, in 1709, Parliament invents what's called the General Naturalization Act. And basically, this is an act that says any foreign person who's willing to swear an oath of allegiance to the English crown, take sacrament in the Church of England, pay 1 shilling, then they would be, quote, as if they were born in this kingdom. So they wanted the Huguenots to come, but trouble begins the same year that the Naturalization Act is passed. 13,000 immigrants from the Rhine region of northwest Germany enter England. And these German migrants were dubbed the Poor Palatines. This is a woodcut from 1709. I'm sorry about the quality, but I think it may be one of the first representations of a modern refugee camp. The Palatines formed a camp outside of London. It was crowded, it was full of disease. They were dependent a lot upon charity from church groups and so on. The reason the Palatines came to England is not quite clear to historians. Some people argue that they also faced religious persecution. Others suggest that they were fleeing the effects of a really cold, hard winter, and their crops had been, they were mainly farmers. What is clear, we don't know why they came exactly, or there's multiple interpretations, is that they did not receive a warm welcome. The Tory critics likened them to the plague. And eventually, they were shipped off to America, where many of them died en route. And I nearly jumped out of my skin. I'm sorry for the quality of this, but I found this in an old newspaper at the Clark Library, which was a table that basically breaks down how many of them died en route and how many of them arrived. It's sort of odd way of accounting. I can't really, in the frame I have with you today, I can't really do justice to the history of naturalization or to these particular refugee groups, but I want to emphasize a few points as they are coming clear to me today. One, naturalization in the 18th century is not about the freedom to settle. Before the 19th century, and this is really important, England was a country of open borders. It didn't regulate who could come. It didn't regulate how long you could stay. But if you did come and you wanted to receive some positive benefits, such as the right to purchase property or to pass down some effects to an heir, then you had to be naturalized. So it was a bonus, basically, a very nice bonus. And it also allowed you to sit in government offices. Second, naturalization in the 18th century is all about property, not about political rights. The question of nationality in this period is all about whether a foreign-born son can inherit from an English father or vice versa, whether an English son can inherit from a foreign father. This is the whole question of the problem for jurists. Lastly, and most importantly for me, naturalization in the period doesn't promise to make a foreigner the same as a natural-born subject. It's not a declaration of a primordial natural right, such as you start to see in the 1789 Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which sort of launched the French Revolution. And unlike the 20th century concept of naturalization, there's no expectation that a naturalized foreigner will speak the same language, engage in the same national customs, or even become more English over time. And today, some of you may not know what it requires to be naturalized in America. You have to have a green card, and you have to have a green card for 5 years. And you have to live in the United States continuously for that period. You have to read, write, and speak English, have a basic understanding of civics and government, be, quote, of sound moral character, and 6, demonstrate an attachment to the ideals of the US Constitution. So to arrive at naturalization today is to arrive fully realized with secure bonds and attachments. This is a huge contrast from early naturalization, which was just kind of a legal design to settle matters of property, rather than create some sort of sense of national inclusion and belonging. The radicalness of this early naturalization stuff, it can't really be overstated. The General Naturalization Act effectively moved the location of nationality from a prior basis in birthright to qualities of faith, finance, and language. And it was precisely the kind of rhetorical basis of the act, the idea that it could just produce subjects who just swore an oath, that produced really strong opposition from conservative critics who interpreted the act to mean that anyone could just become an English person in language. This is something I found in the archive. It was a poem. And a lot of times in the period, poetry was used to disseminate political opinions. It was designed to manipulate opinion against the Naturalization Act. And it's quite long, but the gist of it is that the refugees are likened to canary birds that were brought over by Spanish sailors in the 17th century. And the author argues that these canary birds are going to disturb the English utopia. So it's like a very elaborate, extended metaphor about birds, but you get the idea. But for all of the radicalness I just spoke of about naturalization, it was a really limited form too. It was really designed to attract a select group of migrants. Over the course of the 18th century, it was going to face challenges from other people who were perceived as threats: Jews, Catholics, and free blacks dubbed the Black Poor. The Jewish Naturalization Act of 1753 was narrowly passed by the Whigs in Parliament and then swiftly repealed, and it produced an enormous wave of anti-Semitism in the country. And here's this a kind of satirical swipe at critics of Jewish naturalization, you see a bunch of kingly people who are frightened at a, quote, nasty, great, ugly Jew bill, which is really this rolled up scroll on the floor. It was sort of a depiction of the threat that supposedly this legal maneuver would have. I'm actively researching a little bit more right now about the Black Poor, who were a combination of former slaves and black sailors from America who were settled in a colony in Sierra Leone because they were unwanted in London, so they were kind of lured away to this new colony with the promise that they would be given citizenship there and protection from the Royal Army. This is similar to what England did with the Palatines, right? Ship the problem away rather than develop a legal design to integrate people in England itself. So given all of these failures in the 18th century and then more seismically after World War II, where naturalization is all but suspended for refugees, it may seem odd that I'm actually even interested in this history. But even though naturalization only affected a small number of migrants, it opened up a public debate about who could be received and granted privileges in the nation. And this debate, as I'm going to try and suggest to you now, survives and is transformed by the fiction that's running alongside of it. The refugee movements in the 18th century and 17th century, they're managed through naturalization. In fact, it could be argued that naturalization is invented to manage them. But at the same time that naturalization is devising new rules about national inclusion, the novel's developing as a new genre. The novel gets its name novel because it was new at the time. And one of the things that made it so new is that it introduced all kinds of new subjects into literature. Servant girls, slaves, orphans, middle-class businessmen. Just about anybody who, under classical rules of genre, especially of tragedy, would never be considered a subject of literature. So I'm interested in the novel and naturalization in one sense because they're both forms that create new subjects who have previously been unrecognized, right? So there's just that basic parallel. But in fact, as I've been researching this project, I've learned more about law from novels sometimes than from archival materials. And I think that may be because the novel is a more sustained space of imagination. So it's a place where people can really experiment with ideas, and especially of identity and connection, in ways that are sort of limited in newspaper debates. And the other reason I'm interested in it is that if you just study naturalization as a legal history, you're going to be confined to the Protestants, mainly the Huguenots. But the novel, when it takes up naturalization, it introduces the topic and extends it into empire, the discussions of race, ideas that if you strictly just stick to the archival materials on naturalization, you're likely to miss. So I'm not the first person, of course, to think that the novel has particular political importance in the 18th century. Many incredible scholars have argued that the 18th century novel and the 19th century novel is a handmaiden to the emergence of the nation state, and that the novel helped forge a sense of what it meant to be an English Protestant. Edward Said and Benedict Anderson are probably the two most important examples. Said argued in Culture and Imperialism that the novel narrated the English imperial project. And he argued that the novel was a concretely historical narrative and that you could learn a lot about empire and colonialism from studying it. Benedict Anderson had similar ideas, but differently. In his very famous book, Imagined Communities, he argued that the novel became a form where individuals could come to understand themselves as members of a collective. And it did that by mimicking the structure of a clearly bordered national community. I'm not here to disagree with those theories, but one thing I have noticed is that after reading so much about naturalization and rereading so many of these seminal novels, I've come to see that the novel was thinking about the borders of national identity just as much as it was allegedly defining them. Novelists in the period were experimenting with ways to expand the possibilities of naturalization, especially after the repeal of the General Naturalization Act, and then later after the repeal of the Jewish Naturalization Act. And it's extraordinary to me how many novels that we've long read as conservative or as vested in deep nationalisms are actually engaging questions about naturalization that if you kind of understand a little bit about the law, you can begin to notice. And I'm going to give 3 examples, and I'm picking them essentially because these are popular 18th century novels that have been read as providing kind of nativist origin stories for the English nation. First one, Robinson Crusoe, published by Daniel Defoe in 1719. And everybody knows this novel, even if they haven't read it, right? It's the story of the shipwrecked Englishman who creates a plantation on an island with the help of his colonized subject, Friday. Karl Marx called Crusoe the ideal English Homo economicus. James Joyce referred to Crusoe as the true prototype of the English colonizer. Edward Said agreed. But there's so much going on in the novel with Crusoe's legal identity. The very first line of the novel, we learn that Crusoe's father is a German foreigner. He's from the same region in Germany, in fact, that so many of the German migrants had come to seeking refuge in England. Most people skip this observation, but, and this is something I've uncovered in the archives as well, according to a law called the Aliens Law of the time, Crusoe, as the son of a foreigner, would not have been able to inherit anything. So that gives a new spin to the reason why he may have left England to seek fortune elsewhere. The other, and it also means that he couldn't colonize an island in the name of England, as Edward Said kind of insists he does. Later in the book, and this is a smaller detail that's been neglected as well, Crusoe takes an oath of naturalization so that he can buy this plantation in Brazil. And then he purchases some slaves. And so technically, the entire time he's on the island, he is a Portuguese Catholic subject under the law. And so when he reclaims all of his profits after being rescued from the island, he discovers that a lot of the profits of his plantation have gone to supporting the Portuguese Empire. And Defoe, I'm not just reading this into the novel, I should say, Defoe was really aware of what he was doing because he was a journalist prior to being a novelist. And he was one of the biggest journalists to write on the Palatine refugee crisis. In fact, he was one of the few who agitated to have the Palatines settled in England. So if you start looking at the novel this way, it emerges as a book that's a warning to England about what's going to happen if it doesn't settle its foreigners. That's one reading of it. So that's one of the books I've sort of re-examined. The second is a book called Lawrence Stearns' Sentimental Journey Through France and Italy. This is published in 1768. It's one of the most famous novels of the 18th century, though many of us don't remember it today. It was one of Thomas Jefferson's favorite novels. It's loosely a story about an English man named Yorick who goes over to France and he's by sneaking into somebody else's carriage. And when he gets there, he has all of these sentimental encounters with people that he meets. And most scholars read it as a kind of satire of bourgeois humanitarianism because the level of his sentimental encounters are a bit dubious. They're often sexual or, overblown. But again, like Robinson Crusoe, the novel is framed from its very beginning by a law about foreigners. The very first lines of this novel as well, we learn that Yorick is subject to a bitter French law called the Law over Strangers, which would stipulate that if he died while he was in France, the French monarch could take all of his property. The Law over Strangers, and there's some great historical work on it by the historian Peter Salins, it's more than a feudal tax. In the time period, it's the only way that France has to make a stipulation between who's a subject of France and who's an alien. And so to kind of evade it, there's this amazing moment. It's one of my favorite in all of literature, I think, where Yorick discovers that if he's going to evade detention and evade the effects of this law, he has to come up with a passport, but he doesn't have one. So he discovers that there's a shop, and he goes in and he buys Shakespeare's Hamlet, and he goes to the count who meets out passports for foreigners and says, opens it to the gravedigger's passage and says, "That's me," and just points to the name Yorick. And it's this really funny passage that I can't do justice to. Lawrence Stern is an incredible writer, where he's not technically lying, but the count gets mistaken and thinks that he's another Yorick, so this third Yorick, who's a famous court jester. And so the count decides to give him this passport, and this is an illustration of the moment. And then Yorick is free to stay in Paris and bumble around and have some more sentimental encounters. This novel is really ahead of its time, I think, in asking questions about the distinction between private and political identity. And the book has a lot to teach us about passports before the age of biometrics, because in the 18th century, a passport was a florid letter of introduction. Someone says, "Oh yeah, I know this guy, let him in." There's no physical descriptions on it. And so it's this beautiful interplay of language that lets Yorick sort of sneak in using Hamlet as a introduction for himself. So that's another one. The last one is Frankenstein, which is enjoying its 200th year anniversary this year. And the novel, as we all know, has many interpretations. One of the most seminal is that it's a warning about what will happen if people stray too far from their native home, which Victor Frankenstein does when he goes off to college, and you start to create life outside of the conditions of natural birth. And like the other two novels, this one has a legal, political dimension too. Scholars prefer the 1818 version of the text. It's often considered as the more original or pure scholarly edition. But in 1831, when she revised it, Mary Shelley changes Victor Frankenstein's birthplace. Instead of being a citizen of Geneva after the style of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, she has him born in Italy, and then he becomes naturalized in Geneva. In the 19th century, Geneva was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in Europe. Even before then, it was one of the biggest places of refuge for the persecuted Huguenots. But the city had a real current of unrest at the time, of which Mary Shelley was aware. She had written about it in her letters. Over time, the number of people who could be citizens of Geneva had grown smaller. So in this context, Victor Frankenstein's monster emerges as what we might call the ultimate unnaturalized foreigner. At one point, he meets a blind old man in the countryside, and the old man asks him who he is, and asks him if he's a French man. And the monster replies, "Well, French is the only language I speak, but I'm not French." And so like the sans-papier today, he exists within the state, but goes completely unrecognized by it. And I'm hoping that what I want to do more with Frankenstein is to attach these kind of legal readings to some of the brilliant work that's been done on the creature's race, because it's emphasized repeatedly in the novel that he's not white, he's not or European, and so I think we could definitely see the novel in conjunction to debates about the black poor at the end of the 18th century who were shipped off to a colony rather than dealt with in law in England. So that's kind of what I'm looking at there. There's so many more I could tell you about. There's this really funny one called The Adventures of Ferdinand Can't Fathom, which features a protagonist who's born in a wagon that's passing over the border of Holland and Flanders, and his head comes out in Holland, but his feet come out in Flanders. And then the rest of the novel is everyone trying to figure out where he's from. But I won't tell you, I'll stop there. I'm uncovering a different story about the 18th century novel, and the novels I read show awareness about the lives of migrants and migration. They show awareness about the effect of policy and law on identity. And they're grappling with scenarios that nationality law in its infancy was just only beginning to work out. What happens if you're born outside the country that your parents are born in? Can you have allegiance to two countries? How does your legal identity change when you migrate? Why do we allocate subjecthood according to the circumstances of birth? It seems to me that some of the early readings of the novel are partial, selective, and maybe ignore important elements that can help us rethink notions of identity and belonging that sometimes we take for granted today. One of the conclusions I reached in my study of Arendt was that Arendt thought that each generation had to study the conditions of its own immigration crisis from within its own time. I think that's basically right, except I think that if we're going to do that, we have to rethink the very mythologies that perpetuate the coupling of nationality and birth. And I think the novel can help us. It can help us rediscover alternative, perhaps more inclusive principles to relate to those beyond the borders of our limited national geography and political imagination. I also think that the novel can shed light on other ideas that have been eclipsed by the rise of the nation state and birthright citizenship in the past 2 centuries. At least that's what I'm going to be trying to think about for the remainder of my time here. So I'll end with those thoughts. Thank you so much.